is trying to fix the equipment. And so anyway, I'm here with my co-host, Paul Vattiato. Good morning, or good evening, Paul.
Long day, David, huh? Good evening.
Good evening, good evening. It's been an interesting week. I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving. And I know I had too much turkey. And I don't know about you. Well, you went somewhere nice. You went to the Sunday House.
I went to Sunday House here in Delray, and Thanksgiving is always a joy there. A little chill in the air, which was really nice. But that's the day of Thanksgiving and forgiveness.
Okay.
So Thanksgiving, you can go out and be thankful for all that you have, and forgiveness for all that you ate that you really shouldn't have.
I like that. Even you don't even have to be a caregiver to overeat. No. And sometimes it's solace because Thanksgiving is great comfort food. All right.
Good for the soul.
Right. Anyway, I was very pleased to see the reaction last week to having our wives on, and I thought they were very candid, and I thought they spoke very, very well on the subject of what it is like to be the person being cared for, and their perspective on what it is that we do for them.
What did you hear, David, that perhaps you might have found a little surprising?
What I found was in one of my support groups that had been watching the show, they were surprised at the candor that our wives had and how directly they spoke, and that they were very free in explaining not only what had happened in their lives, but what it meant to them now and the role that we play. And while that was the topic of what we were doing, I think it surprised many people that it was as direct. I won't call it blunt, but it was very emphatic and very direct. And I think that our audience needs to understand something, that your wife is a boomer, all right? My wife is a little bit older. So am I, but I was just on the front edge of boomer. I was born in 43 instead of 46. And one of the things I'm observing, and you and I have been talking about it, is what is going on with boomers in terms of seeing dementia earlier and earlier. And I use dementia only because it's the bellwether for the most difficult things involved in caregiving. I'm not saying that it isn't the same for Parkinson's or somebody that's had cancer and a lot of radiation and a lot of other things, but the age of caregivers is moving backwards. It's going towards the children of boomers, much to our unfortunate surprise. And one of the things, there were a couple of interesting reports out. I know I sit in the stream of that stuff. That even though the boomers are doing their best and their children are, that obesity and diabetes is still rampant. And it's just amazing how many young children, not only do we see things like autism, which we're trying to understand, and ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, but what we're seeing is kids that don't seem to care about their bodies and themselves. And I think that that's a direct reflection on parents. I'm constantly amazed, and while it shouldn't come as a surprise when I'm at the mall, how many people are overweight and have children that look just like them, and the destruction that they're doing to their bodies and what that means longer term is incredible, because they don't understand. It's only when you get to a certain age. That's one of the things that gerontology, the study of aging, teaches you, is that you can't have a perspective of a 50-year-old until you become 50.
Got to stand in those shoes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You can't tell somebody who's 20 what it's like to be 40 any more than you can relate to somebody who's 80 when you're 60. Correct. And that's one of the reasons why caregiving sometimes is very difficult. It's not that parents and loved ones want to be obstreperous, or that they want to give everybody a hard time, but they're coming from a completely different age-related experience, and there's no way to watch a movie and figure out what 80 is like any more than what I just said. Then a 50-year-old can go back and relate to a 30-year-old in this day and age. Yes, you lived through 30, but it was 20 years ago, and it was a lifetime away. And we see it everywhere we look. But in any event, I was very proud and pleased at the performance of our wives. I think they did a great job, and I hope that they were able to illuminate and educate a little bit on the problem to our listeners.
I thought it was especially interesting when they were speaking to one another, and they were sharing their experiences and their feelings as it applied not only to themselves and their illnesses, but how it applied to you and I, as you and me as caregivers.
Right. And I think that was the part that was most telling. You know, you and I have been caregiving for a while. I a little longer than you. Even though I do it for others, you lose your perspective when you're doing it for yourself, for your own loved one. And I find myself constantly falling into that trap. And quite frankly, Paul, if it wasn't for you reminding me of what's going on in my life from a caregiving perspective, I get caught on that slippery slope too.
Well, my rates are going up in January.
Okay.
But, you know, speaking upon caregiving and years, a birthday in a couple of days, a significant one, I understand, with a 0 attached to it.
Yes. I'm going to be 70, and I can't believe it. But when I look at my kids and my grandchildren and I see how old they are, I realize that I have reached, I can't call it that magical, but I know recently I've been having a lot of thought as to what I have accomplished in my life and what I haven't. And while you can't go back and redo it, it's very interesting to have a retrospective on where you are and what you've done. And I can't necessarily say that I've lit the world on fire, but I think I've made a difference. I think the 25 years that I've been heavily involved in caregiving and what I've done, and I think I was a leader in it, and I've always tried to give back, and I know that there have been hundreds of caregivers, maybe thousands of caregivers whose lives I've touched, and that is very significant to me. I don't think that anything in my life has been more important, other than my wife and my children, than being able to lead people that are desperate to be led and to understand and to try and deal with things that are beyond their imagination that they ever thought could happen to them, and try and help ground them and give them some direction and a little bit of competent authority and empathy. And so even this year, we started the radio show, and I'm very proud of us in doing that. My caregiver workbook won the FCOA award. I'm proud of that. And my groups have grown. I'm proud of that. And so as I look back, I don't have any regrets, but I just have to put it in perspective because I just can't imagine that I'm 70.
Well, but you would not have been able to do and accomplish what you have had you not made those decisions, right, wrong, or indifferent, the path taken, the path not taken. But those paths that you did take brought that passion that you bring to the work that you do each and every day. And I've seen you do this with countless number of people, from one-on-one to small groups to groups of hundreds, in addressing this issue of non-clinical family caregiving, particularly when no one even knew what it was.
Right. I mean, I long ago I drew a bright blue line of clinical and non-clinical because I never wanted to get in a fight with every neurologist, doctor, psychiatrist, psychologist over what I really felt family caregiving was all about. And so I always stayed on my side of the line. And what I've come to understand is that non-clinical family caregiving, practical problem solving, just can't come out of an academic education by itself unless you have feet on the street, so to speak, and you live it, you watch it. my phone rings constantly, and I hear stories. 3 clients called today that I never knew. 2 of them probably won't be clients because I just helped them out so that they could get over a difficult situation that they were in. And another one probably will become a client of mine. But it never stops, and it's getting faster and faster and thicker. And I'm just surprised that we have not rallied behind the family caregiver. And one of the things tonight is a very interesting report that came out of Canada, for Canada and the United States, that when we get to it in a little while, I think will really make people understand. And it's really directed at the boomer, because what they're truly saying is that we can't keep relying on family caregivers to do everything that we expect them to do with no support, no help. And I think as we see other generations moving up and without nuclear families the way it used to be, is that you have people that just don't have that same, they care about their parents. There are things that they would do for them in a heartbeat, and many won't, but you just don't have that same relationship that we used to have. And I think it's going to be harder and harder to get the children of the boomers to start to step in and do more for them. And I think the boomers, especially age 60 to 70, have no idea, even though they were the Pepsi generation, just how slippery the slope is in their own health, and the fact that dementia and other illnesses like that can creep up and affect them and their families. I'm finding more and more caregivers in their 60s dealing with spouses in their 60s or late 50s that have dementia. And so it can happen to you, it can happen to anyone. And I think we have to understand that just because we came out of a rather infallible period in our lives, that we can expect to see that going forward.
Well, just recognizing it is hard enough. Trying to assume the reality of it, that it may in fact be me who is going to be going down that road, that's a bitter pill to swallow.
Right. And it is.
And making it more complicated, and we were talking about this earlier, is that I am very hard to reach as a baby boomer, because you're not going to mail to me. You're not going to reach me through seminar programs. I rarely respond to advertisements of any sort. So you have to really be able to catch me at a moment where my listening is up. And that's really the hard part, is because they really are, in many cases, afraid to listen.
Well, I think that's a very accurate observation. I mean, we're inundated every day with text and emails and all kinds of social media. And people are revealing their lives in little sound bites. But yet, when it comes to recognizing the realities of what happens in an aging world and what happens in this day and age, where there is not a magic pill for everything, and that dementia is spreading and growing, and that people just have their head in the sand. And I think that my older clients have a greater reality of what's going on than my younger clients do.
The older clients were grounded by World War II and the Great Depression. I mean, those were milestones that shaped who they were and created a mindset of how they lived their lives. When you look at the boomers, yes, there was Vietnam, there was civil rights, there was women's rights. Those movements all happened. Everyone was aboard the wagon one way or the other, for or against. But ultimately, that passion dissipated. And
you're right. And there's no question about it. And you don't see the boomers per se. All right, I'm talking 45 to 70 right now, or 65. I wonder what they are passionate about besides stuff. And I don't mean to belittle anybody because they have, their cars and their houses, etc. But I think that they have overlooked a lot of reality that's rushing at them, that's obvious, but they don't want to see it, and they don't want to address it. And that's one of the objectives that I've always had, was to try and make people understand, not make them afraid, but make them understand that these are things that they are going to have to deal with. And if you don't understand it, and you're just going to wait until the crisis happens and your hair's on fire, then you're really a day late in being able to do a few things, to plan. One of the things in the book that today the Alzheimer's Association came out with a PDF that was on the internet for caregivers, and it was 4 pages of lists. And I don't take anything away from them because they are the bellwether for Alzheimer's.
Right.
But yet, I look to see how you're supposed to interpret what they're telling you. And I don't mean to be self-serving, but here in this book, we not only talk about it, we explain it, and then we show them. How do you go about building a plan for your life and another one's life who you're responsible for? And not just by marriage, but children are being asked, and many children are saying, no, I can't. Maybe I can send some money or do something else, but I know that many, many times when I'm involved with a caregiver and a loved one who are parents, and they say to the kids, can't you? Well, I got a business meeting, the kids have soccer, and their lives are way too busy. But yet, when it happens to them, how have they brought their kids up to understand what they might have to do to step in? And I think that's the thing that we all have to be very, very aware of, that we are totally unprepared for what is happening in an aging world. And we cannot expect the medical profession, especially with dementia, to come up with anything that's going to make a difference, more than likely, for anybody right now who's over the age of 45.
Well, if you believe in you lead by example, what kind of leadership have we really seen from the boomer generations in terms of the caregiving that they provide for their parents?
Well, we've seen some people are very, very responsible for their parents, and they do a good job. Others don't know how to deal with it, don't know where to turn, give it lip service. I'll be down next weekend, I'll drive up from Miami, but, this is all I can do. And I think the idea is that we can always put mom and dad somewhere, but we can't. We don't have the facilities. I've told you that, and you know that from your own experience. We don't have the facilities, the people, the training to put people, outplace them from their homes. And who else is there to do it but the caregiver?
This was the first Thanksgiving that Debbie and I did not have Dad with us. And it was very poignant as we were having dinner, because tradition would be we would have dinner with Dad. He would come with us, and later in his life when he became ill, we would go and spend the afternoon with him for Thanksgiving. And this time it wasn't there because he passed in January. And each of these first events becomes very difficult. But we looked back at what we did over the last 10 years or so had done for my dad.
Yep.
The difference that we made in his life, the things that we probably could have done better, the things that we regret that we didn't do that we really should have done. And in the end, it really was a blessing that I had that opportunity, and Debbie alongside of me, to really create that giving, that care for my dad when he really needed it the most. And I wonder if my children are going to have those same feelings.
Well, that's an interesting question. This Thanksgiving, my daughter was with my ex, and my son is living in Georgia,
Mm-hmm.
and my daughter-in-law took my granddaughter up to North Carolina to visit some relatives. And so what used to be a big event in our lives, which was the family gathering at Thanksgiving, and I'm sure many, many people were able to do that, but it just didn't happen. I don't object to the fact that they went and did what they needed to do, but as a family, it would have been nice to have gotten together. And but you just don't see it.
Well, now they meet up at Walmart, and they get a head start on their holiday shopping.
Oh, God. Black Friday and Cyber Monday and all the rest of it. Although I read in the Wall Street Journal today that sales were down, that no matter how much hype was out there, it didn't happen. But you raised something a few moments ago in regard to your father,
Mm-hmm.
about what you could have done, what you could have done better. And one of the things, and you know it from me, anger, guilt, and resentment are the three-legged stool of caregiving. We always think we could have done a better job, all right? But who's to say that we could have? And what is it that you would have done differently? Paul, I know you very well, and you did for your father everything that you thought needed to be done at the time you had to do it, and you did it with passion and perspective and respect, and Debbie along with you. And so I don't think you have any reason to go back and say to yourself, I regret that I couldn't have done something more. You did everything that you could do. You couldn't reverse the fact that he was over 100. You couldn't change the illnesses that he had, but you certainly helped to provide for him. You were there for him. And in every sense of the word, you were a great son and a phenomenal caregiver. And I don't think you have anything in your life to regret as it relates to taking care of your dad.
We all do the best we can, and so much of it is just showing up.
Mm-hmm. And showing up for life.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're looking at a birthday coming up. How much of that is showing up and doing the things that at the time seem very mundane and unimportant, and then turn out to be real important later on? We just don't recognize it. What we don't know, we don't know.
Right.
That's really
you don't know what you don't know, and that's the problem in caregiving. If you haven't lived with it, and there's a lot of information around that talks around the subject, but the real nitty-gritty of caregiving is that you do get your hands dirty, and it is tough, and the system doesn't like it, and there's an expectation, we're going to discuss that in the next hour, that caregivers are supposed to do it all, that somehow or other we have overlooked one of the greatest care events in the world, all right? Family caregiving. And when it isn't just the flu, as I've always said to you, where it's a magazine, you'll feel better in 2 weeks or your arm's broken, but when it now represents the lifetime of an individual and your intervention on their behalf constantly and the interplay of what that takes, unless you've been there, you can't understand it. And one of the things that we've tried to do on this show, and that I've tried to do over the last 25 years, is bring that recognition to the people that need to understand it. Unfortunately, people usually don't come forward until they're really neck deep in the problem. And, that's a tough time to start.
And there's also the misunderstanding is that, well, I've seen Alzheimer's or I've seen dementia. I know about it. I know what that caregiving is about. And as you've pointed out dozens and dozens of times, what you've seen is one case, because everyone is going to be different. Every caregiver is going to be different, and their reaction to it is going to be different.
And then you add to the mix cultural, ethnic, religious differences, how people approach the whole idea of care for the family, and it even complicates it further. And for the audience out there, we'd love to take a call if anybody wants to ask a question. It's 888-565-1470. and I'm sitting here with Paul talking about the reality of caregiving. And you may turn the radio off because you don't want to hear it, but the reality of the situation is everybody will deal with caregiving, and maybe more than once.
Well, as we learned last week in Debbie's case, she was fine one day, a diagnosis, the next, the life changed.
Right. And it was the same thing for Suzette. She was rolling along, about to become the neuro director for the whole district, and boom, like she said, she all of a sudden found herself, she couldn't stay on her feet for more than an hour or two. She'd come back to her office and sleep on the couch, and all of a sudden began to have brain fog. She couldn't remember what it is that she told people. And that was 10, 11 years ago. So I've watched the progression of that along in my own life, and I think it has driven me to try and do even more for the people that are out there when it comes to caregiving. We got to go to a station break. You're listening to us on WWNN 1470 AM or caregiverreality.com. And as I said, we'd love to hear from you, 888-565-1470. But if you don't call and you're just listening, we're going to continue to give you an earful. Let's go to the station break.
Talk 1470 WWNN Pompano Beach, WKIS HD3 Boca Raton, Miami, Fort Lauderdale.
Hello, are you a family caregiver? Are you taking care of a spouse, parent, or loved one who can no longer care for themselves? Are you dealing with Alzheimer's disease and don't know what to do? Are you stressed, burned out, frustrated, and don't know where to turn? Have you have real practical answers? You need a non-clinical family caregiver expert that the professionals turn to. You need David Levy. He is a family caregiver expert with 25 years of active experience with thousands of family caregivers. He can help you provide a better quality of life for you and your loved one. Contact David Levy at dlevy@caregivered.org. That's dlevy@caregivered.org. Or call 561-482-0086. And let's get your mental road to healing started.
Well, we're back, and it's the Caregiver Reality Show, and I'm here with my co-host, Paul. And we've just been discussing the reality of caregiving and the fact that there are generations of people right on the cusp of caregiving that have not even come to grips with the idea that this may impact their lives for a long time. And many young people have experienced it because of things like I mentioned earlier, and you talk about autism, ADHD, and other childhood illnesses and diseases. And those parents are caregivers for the better part of their lives because the big problem that they have is separating out the maternal and the paternal role from the one of caregiving. It usually takes until the child is 7, 8, 9 years old for them to finally realize that they're on a whole different course than their friend down the block and the other kids in the neighborhood.
And one of their greatest fears is what happens to their child when something happens to them.
And that's why you have to have a plan. You just have to. We plan so many other things in life. We plan for our death better than we do for our life. I mean, we do pre-need funerals, and we have wills and trusts and make sure that everything's intact when we die. But we don't plan for the difficult things that are going to happen to us. You wouldn't go on vacation without planning. I mean, you got to know what boat you're getting on or what flight you're on and where you're going and did you make a reservation. People don't even do that in preparation, even when they see their loved one and family around them beginning to fail. It's whether it's a question of denial or not knowing what to do. It's a very, very difficult role. And there are a lot of people out there that have just buried their heads in the sand and say, not me. But I want to tell you folks, yes, it is you. Paul, one of the things I know you had, I will call it a traumatic event, because I think it was a big expectation of yours that you and Debbie were planning on retiring to that great little house you had up in Sebring. I know because I've been there. And all of a sudden, in the last 6 months, and especially in the last couple of months, the reality that that's not really going to happen. But why don't you tell us what you did this weekend?
Sure. It had been our dream that this was going to be our retirement. This is where we were going to be going. And in the interim, while we were both still working, we had been and continued to plan to go up on weekends, head out on a Friday afternoon. We used to go out and do our little country dancing and go out and have some good down-home food.
Yep.
And then head back on Sunday and back to work on Monday. We thought nothing of that drive, and it was a question, well, we'll go down to 4 days and do that, and then 3 days of working, and gradually work our way into that. But after Debbie got sick, the reality was we weren't going up. Debbie wasn't well enough to make the trip. The car ride, she was not able to drive. The car ride was even too difficult for her to go up.
Staying alone during the work week, if she wanted to
Impossible.
stay up there, wasn't going to work.
Too many things happening too quickly. The unpredictability of the illness was such that if she wasn't frightened, I was.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just a matter that we wanted to be together, but in a way there was a necessity of us being together because help at times was really needed.
Right, I can appreciate that.
Yeah, so
what you did is you had a great room in Sebring. I loved it because it was both nautical and colorful. It was red, white, and blue.
We spent a lot of time and a lot of our personal energy. We were emotionally invested in the way that we put it together because it was something that we really both enjoyed doing, and it was traveling to many places to get just that right piece. Well, the conversations really started to shift, I'd say, during the summer when we came to the conclusion that things really aren't going to get better. We'll have better days, and we'll feel better at times, but the plan that we originally had probably wasn't going to be the reality of what it was. And there's a couple of ways that we could have reacted to it. Number one was that it was a huge disappointment and a huge regret, and just become overwhelmed with the unhappiness of what that was. But we knew that we had to sell it. We made that decision, and we were going to get it ready to sell. So what we did was we said, let's bring that Sebring feel back home to Boynton Beach. And what we did was we took one of the rooms in the condo that we live in, and we totally recreated it to represent the Sebring feel, the country feel, the lake feel. And we picked out the pieces that had that special meaning. And rather than it being a time of thoughtful regret, it's now a time of great remembrances. And it was, do you remember when? And the good times and the events that we still can enjoy in looking back by going home, and now looking forward at what our new next will be. And with whatever limitations there may or may not be, is knowing that there is going to be a next, and each day that we have is going to be that blessing that we're going to maximize out. So we go into the room, it lights up, you have that same feeling, and it's part of our life, our marriage, our relationship that we now enjoy every day as we go into that room.
You know, Paul, you have a phenomenal attitude faced with the situations that you're faced with, and yet you are a half-full glass person, not a half-empty. And you take every opportunity to take a negative situation and turn it around. And my hat is off to you, because you're a rare kind of caregiver that doesn't sit and bemoan their fate and takes the bull by the horns, recognizing that you can't do a whole lot about the illness itself, but your attitude about your wife and those little gestures. I mean, it's a big gesture to change your house around to look like it did in Sebring, but I think that's just...
Oh, I just dread going back to motor vehicles and having to have my...
cars re-registered?
Yeah, cars re-registered and all of that. But on a more serious note, as a caregiver, I had not only to deal with the reality of having a house that I really couldn't go to, but it was also managing the expectations of Debbie and recognizing that she was invested in that life, and I didn't want to pull the rug out from under her and just let that reality crash onto her. So it was baby steps, it was discussions, and it was finally we came to a decision. This was the better choice for us, and here was a way of capturing some of what we did. And I did a second thing, or I should say we did a second thing, because in 2015 we had planned a renewal of our wedding vows. We got married in the Caribbean, and we went ahead and we booked a trip in 2015 for that renewal. And
that's great.
And I said to Debbie, all you need to do is be well enough to go.
Right.
And it's that you have to have things in life that you look forward to. That really is what pushes you forward, pushes you through the disease. Debbie didn't wish this for herself.
Right. Nobody wishes it for
themselves. It happens, but as a caregiver, part of what we have to do is to manage those expectations and find ways to bring joy in whatever way we can.
Well, you know, one of the things that I tell caregivers, and I have to remember it from myself, is that you always have to look forward to the next day. And today I happen, as I told you earlier, as I approach my 70th birthday, I sat down this afternoon, and I don't know how many in the audience know what TED is, TED, but it's an organization that's been around for 30 years, and it puts together phenomenally interesting people who give speeches, and the next one is at Whistler up in British Columbia, and there was one in Orlando not too long ago. And so I went back through about 10 of the, because they're only 18 to 20 minutes long, and people talking about happiness and gratitude and why things are the way they are. And I re-listened to one that I find fascinating about a neuroscientist who was working at Harvard trying to understand her brother's schizophrenia when she had a stroke. And she, as a professional, went through the whole rehabilitation and having the stroke. And as a professional now describes it. And it was absolutely fascinating. She said at one point, because of the stroke, your brain, when it has that kind of shock, releases what are called endorphins. And that's what is a natural high. Mm-hmm. And she said when she had her stroke, she was so high that she wasn't sure that she wanted to come back, because it was an absolutely incredible feeling. And I recommend it to anybody. It's called tedactive.com. And if you've got a few minutes to watch and listen, you will find just a world of interesting things on digital tape. And it's wonderful.
They're also now topic specific. There is TED Meds, which is just talks that have to deal with medical issues, scientific issues. So they have it on philosophy, they have it on religion, they have it on a variety of topics. And whatever you might want to listen to, it really is inspirational.
Yes.
And it's probably the best 10 minutes of the day you're going to find.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, when you're down in the dumps, to turn around and have a little positive affirmation from things like that really makes a difference. Our good friend Dr. David Hilfiker is still traveling, but he did post a blog on the 28th, right, the day before Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving Day. And I'd like to read it because I find it very fascinating. And he calls this the elevator version, and as I've said in the past, I read it because there's just no way to paraphrase him.
David, just for those that just tuned in for the first time tonight, give a little background about who David Hilfiger is.
Dr. David Hilfiger is a general practitioner who practiced medicine both in the rural hinterlands of the United States and then came back to minister with medicine to the poor in Washington, D.C. And about 4 years ago, he began to notice something was going on with him, and he had all of the markings of mild cognitive impairment. And about 2 years ago, he started to write a blog because he was absolutely convinced, even though his doctor said mild cognitive impairment, all of his research friends said Alzheimer's. So he started to do a blog called I Have Alzheimer's, describing what he was going through and the memory loss and that whole situation. Then about a month ago, he had gone to the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, and they had put him through a whole battery of cognitive and diagnostic tests, including scans of his brain, and couldn't find anything.
Amazing.
But yet, he described the following week or two that his cognitive impairment was still there and that it was progressing even though they couldn't find anything. And he felt very detached. He had kind of gotten used to saying, I have Alzheimer's, and becoming the persona of that individual.
Yeah.
And so this one is called the elevator version, and he wrote this on Thanksgiving. He says, I'm finding it difficult to come up with material for this blog. I think it's a form of writer's block. I suspect it has to do with my fixation on the scientifically determined medical diagnosis that he just got. For those of you who haven't been following this blog, all my objective tests for causes, or even for cognitive impairment himself, have been normal. Yet I'm still convinced it's Alzheimer's. Why? I know I'm impaired. And so that's probably the leading to it. 80% of all people with cognitive impairment have Alzheimer's. The pattern of my symptoms is typical of Alzheimer's. My medical tests have shown no evidence for any other cause of cognitive impairment. Therefore, I'm convinced the likelihood of Alzheimer's disease is high. So I'm comfortable referring to my cognitive impairment as Alzheimer's as long as I can take a few minutes to explain the scientific uncertainty of the diagnosis. But what do I do in a 2-minute explanation? How do I refer to myself in a posting here for someone who might be visiting for the first time? My discomfort, I think, comes from the fact that when I was practicing as a physician, my patients expected me to confirm their diagnoses scientifically. I was certainly aware that medical testing could be in error, so if the science couldn't explain their symptoms, I didn't discount their experience. If the science and the patient's symptoms didn't agree, my job was to describe the discrepancy, usually at length, and give an opinion, not to make an absolute judgment. So in those cases, I always felt the longer explanation was always necessary. Furthermore, honesty is almost an absolute value for me, and saying I have Alzheimer's when the objective testing suggests otherwise feels misleading. Yet, if I describe my illness in the elevator version as subjective cognitive impairment, almost no one's going to understand what I'm talking about. So such a description is misleading too. So in fact, describing myself as having Alzheimer's is less misleading. Nevertheless, I'm emotionally uncomfortable without the qualification. I believe I need to get over my qualms. I will change the introduction to my blog and to my website to reflect the uncertainty. But despite my discomfort, I will include the word Alzheimer in my 2-minute elevator version. I hope that getting over my irrational scruples will help break this writer's block. I remain grateful for the support so many of you have expressed. And I talked to him about a week ago after he had had his tests, and he was really having a very difficult time trying to relate what he knows he's going through and the fact that diagnostically they couldn't determine anything. but yet he knows how he feels. He's a doctor by training, and yet he's very honest about what's happening to him in his life. And the reason that we read this is because I think his objectivity about somebody succumbing to an illness, and here is a perfect example of having the symptoms, but they can't find the illness. And I don't want anybody to think out there, if you've got cognitive impairment, that A, you do have Alzheimer's, but you can't discount it. And I think the most important thing is once you realize that your senior moments are happening far too often, and that the things that everybody walks into a room at a certain age and forgets why they walked in there or where they put their eyeglasses, etc. But when you really begin to have difficulty with keeping your checkbook, accounting for money, doing the things that you always did, difficulty in realizing where you are in driving, etc., you really need to have that checked out. And not because there's necessarily anything that one can do right now. There are a few medications around, but nothing that's going to turn it around. Maybe it'll slow it down a little bit. But I think that when that begins to happen, in fairness to you and your family, you need to understand it so that they can begin to plan. How are they going to make sure that you stay as independent as possible, that your quality of life is as high as it can be, and that your dignity is respected? And I think that that's so terribly important, but trying to come up with those things at the last minute, Paul, I think is very difficult, and you got to be a planner. And I know you're a planner. I'm watching what you're doing right now.
Well, and that is part of the problem, is the label or labeling. It's that we want to be able to say definitively it's A, B, or C, and unfortunately the world doesn't work that way. The diagnosis in his case said one thing, but the behaviors clearly indicated a second.
Right.
And I can't imagine the shock that must have overcome him to hear those test results and knowing what his reality is on a day-to-day basis. I mean, that would just blow my mind.
Yep, and it's blowing his, in every sense of the word.
Did you get to speak to his wife?
No, I haven't had an opportunity, because when he called me back, she was in Washington and he was out in Oregon heading to Wyoming with his sister. So I haven't had an opportunity to speak to her, but I'm going to try and do that. I just want to let the audience know, a couple weeks ago I had on one of my caregivers, whose name was Herb, who gave us a very interesting discussion about his wife, who is in an Alzheimer's facility, and how he was introduced to a woman, and they started to not necessarily have a sexual relationship, but just a relationship to kind of help fill those hollow pieces of his life that he couldn't share. And she's an extraordinary woman. She goes to the dementia facility to take care of his wife, both with and without him. And she has agreed to come on next week.
Oh, wow.
And be a guest with us and to discuss. I won't call her the other woman, because that would be very, very unfair. But to see how somebody who is helping not only the person with dementia, but the caregiver, get through some of these hurdles. And she's been widowed twice, so she understands what's going on. And she's an extraordinary person, and everybody out there in our listening audience, you should really block out next week 6:30 to 7:30 to listen to her, because it's going to be a real eye-opener.
Well, you mentioned before the term non-nuclear family, or the nuclear family no longer exists. What a perfect example.
Yes. And while his family is supportive, he has two sons, they're doctors, and they understand what's going on. And even at the time that he had to make the decision to put his wife, their mother, into a facility, and I was very instrumental in helping him do that, they still said, Dad, we'll support whatever you do. And that's fine. All right, but he kind of at the time had expected them to take a little more involvement. And I think that many children today say, Mom, Dad, whatever you do is okay with us, but they don't, and there are times when a family really needs to be a family, and that husband or wife or whatever the relationship may be is turning to their family and saying, yeah, I know that you'll support me in whatever I do, but I'd sure like some more interaction. Not necessarily that you have to run down here, but don't just tell me that you're happy, that you'll support me in what I do, because how do I even know I'm making the right decisions? And that's what family's all about, and we're losing that. And so as we go forward with the show, one of the things that we're going to try and bring to the audience is a much greater awareness of what this is all about in caregiving, and the fact that it's happening at a younger age, and a lot of people just don't want to raise their hand and volunteer. They either don't have the time, they're not in proximity, et cetera, but yet we have 50 million caregivers in America today, and we do them a great disservice by assuming that they're in a position, financially, emotionally, physically, and every other way, that they're in a position to do the job. It's a great presumption on the part of this country, the medical profession, society at large, that just because you're a spouse or a relative, that you can jump into that job and be expected to do it unrelenting, day after day, week after week, without real guidance, without real support, without real recognition. And I think we're doing ourselves a tremendous disservice by expecting that. I, as a caregiver, you as a caregiver, have never really looked to others except ourselves, and you and I back and forth to support one another. But yet I don't have to make a placement decision right now. But yet the kids ask, how's Mom? And the answer they get is, well, things are the same, and that's what they want to hear.
Well, support isn't necessarily the lack of opposition.
Very true.
And everyone will define support differently. I think it's more an issue of communication. Like in the case of Herb, what is he actually looking to hear, or what would he like to receive?
Well, I think what he was looking to hear was that, Dad, I know you got a difficult decision. However, let's talk about it. Let's really kind of pick it apart. I know you've made certain arrangements, and we have no problem with that. But I think that they thought that the whole situation revolved around what to do with Mom, as opposed to how do we support Dad. And I think that's the real issue in caregiving.
And that gets lost in so many cases, so much of the time.
Right. It gets lost in the background noise because we're focused on the patient. And that's rightly so. But yet we don't really realize how much we've asked of others to step in and be that support, without any real knowledge, guidance, money, whatever it may take to do the job. And we're getting near the end of this show. And Paul, I thought tonight was a very revealing show. I mean, I think we just called it like it is. And I'm very pleased to have you as a friend, to have you as the kind of support that you give me as a caregiver, and I try and give you back. And I think we reflect well on one another.
And similarly, David, you are my support group. And I think for our listeners out there who are caregivers, there are people out there who understand your plight. There are groups that you can go to, that you can get some guidance, and just to validate the feelings that you have, positive or negative, and more importantly, with a good leader, and I know you're a great one, David, to get some of that practical problem solving of, I'm having difficulty doing this. How in the world do I make it work
Right.
every day?
And having a great support group has people there that have been through the experience, can lend the validation that they too went through what you're going through, so it's not unique. And I think that's one of the most important things in caregiving, is realizing what you think is the totally unique situation for you is replicating itself time and time again across 50 million people.
And that's what this radio show
Is really
is
about.
to our caregivers. It's a place where they can come and get that information, that validation, and have an opportunity to talk to someone who is an acknowledged expert on the fact,
Right. And
besides living it.
You're absolutely right. I thank you for that. I thank you for reminding me that I'm going to be 70. And so Boca Raton, Florida, and the world. You won't be around for my birthday, but you can have a piece of cake. I'll bring it in next week.
You'll see the candles burning from afar.
Right, yes. Matter of fact, I'm going to have to get the giant sheet cake because there's no way to put 70 candles on it. So good night and have a good evening.